Okay, so I think the allotted time has started, so I'll get going. Welcome to this session about literature reviews with MAXQDA. I'm Christina Silva. You can see all my contact details up there. And as I said in my earlier session, I do really very much enjoy hearing how people use MAXQDA. I'm very much a methodologist, and I really like to think about how we can translate our methods needs into the use of software. So really happy to hear from you and to field any follow-up questions that anyone might have afterwards. So do feel free to get in touch. And you can also see at the top there that there's a few open registration MAXQDA workshops I've got coming up over the next few months that you might like to tap into. Okay, let's get going and think about literature reviews. So I really like to forefront our strategies, our analytic strategies, what we plan to do in our research work. And to that end, I just want to say a few things about literature review methodologies. Here's an article that gives us an overview of 14 different review types. And here you can see what some of those are. And I really like to be thinking about, okay, well, how can we use MAXQDA? I'm going to use MAXQDA differently according to the type of literature review that I'm doing. Okay, and one of the things that people are often saying to me is, oh, you know, I didn't realize I could do a literature review using MAXQDA. I thought MAXQDA was about doing qualitative data analysis of primary data like interview transcripts or whatever it might be. And of course, it's very useful for those purposes, but literature reviewing is a form of qualitative data analysis, isn't it? Because literature is a form of qualitative data. What is a piece of literature? It's text and images. What is qualitative data? Text, images, and other materials. What is reviewing? Reviewing is a form of reading, thinking, analyzing our materials. So we very much can think about the tools that MAXQDA has as being just as relevant to undertaking a literature review as any other form of qualitative data analysis. So the first point, I guess, is to think about very clearly about what is it that you need to do with your literature based on your literature review method, okay? And the idea that that would be different amongst these different reviews. Having said that, I also think there are a few high-level processes or activities that we all engage in when we do any of those types of literature reviews. So we all need to specify the objectives of our review and generate research questions, however precise or loose they may be. We all need to identify relevant materials to include in a review. We need to capture the evidence, capture the interesting things in the materials. We need to appraise that. We need to think about, what is this all about? What's the quality? What's the critical appraisal that we bring to that from our human interpretation? We need to synthesize things. We need to bring things together in various ways, and we need to communicate our findings. So I would argue amongst those different literature review methods are these 6 high-level processes, which are enacted in different ways depending on the review method. But that bit in the middle, hopefully you can see my big purple cursor here, this big bit in the middle, planning and iteration, is really, really important. We plan each stage, we change our plans, we iterate, we go backwards and forwards between all of these phases. And this is all at the kind of strategies level, I would argue. How does that come into play within the context of MAXQDA, which is what we're here primarily to think about today? Well, the thing that I like to think about in terms of those review types is that there's kind of like a spectrum, a bit like there's a spectrum of qualitative methods more generally. There's also a spectrum of review types. So there are some that are classed as more systematic. So systematic literature reviews, for example, are heralded as being very rigorous. And they are often contrasted with what we might call more in-depth reviews. And those kind of distinctions are useful to think about because they do affect the way we think about what we do with our literature according to those different review types. And we can make some broad distinctions between on the left-hand side, the more systematic, as it were, side of things, that we are therefore more strict about how we go about identifying materials to be part of a systematic review, for example, how we decide which to take forwards, the inclusion and exclusion criteria, etc. And they tend to be also more quantitative in the way that we think about analysing them. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the more in-depth literature reviews may be a literature review that's part of a bigger research study that has the aim of identifying gaps in the literature in order to come up with research questions. They tend to be more flexible and maybe more qualitative. The point about methods and tools, and I'm thinking about MAXQDA as the tools here, is that across this spectrum of review types, MAXQDA has tools that allow us to move along that spectrum at different stages. So we could undertake a very strict formal systematic literature review using MAXQDA tools. We could also undertake very in-depth, iterative, incremental literature review that was much more flexible, much more qualitative, much more interpretive in the way that it was focused, or anything in between. And for me, that's really the power of using tools. The tools within MAXQDA is that I have the flexibility to make decisions about where I am along that methodological spectrum at any given moment, and actually able to combine those. So one of the reasons why systematic and in-depth on this slide are in quotation marks is because I think it's a bit of a shame that the term systematic has been appropriated by a particular type of literature review, because it kind of implies that the more in-depth literature reviews are not systematic, and I have problems with that, because I think in-depth literature reviews are also systematic, even though they're not labelled as such. Anyway, the general point here is to take the needs of the methods and put them into MAXQDA, and we've got a whole variety of tools that we can use in MAXQDA to operationalize our methods in terms of literature reviewing. Okay, so with that in mind, there's a few what I would call initial considerations to think through, and the answers to these are going to be different for all of us maybe, in deciding how to use MAXQDA for a literature review. So firstly, what type of literature review methodology are you using? Secondly, and this is something that I'm going to touch on in detail later on, do you want to work directly with the literature, indirectly, or in a combined way using both those methods? And I'll explain what I mean by the difference between working directly and indirectly in a moment. And also something else that I'm going to focus on today is the extent to which you need to integrate the analysis of the literature with other data. So is your literature review a study in its own right, often a rapid review or a meta-analysis or a systematic literature review is a study in its own right, but a more in-depth literature review, as I mentioned earlier, might be part of a broader study. That kind of research design aspect in terms of your review and how it relates to other materials is really important as well, because that will affect how you go about using MAXQDA. And then finally, what kind of outputs do you need to generate from your literature review? I'm not going to talk about that in detail today, but that is something that I think is really, really important to consider. Okay, so my task, the topic or the title of this spotlight is doing literature analysis using MAXQDA, and in some respects that's a kind of impossible task, because there are so many MAXQDA features that we have at our disposal, things that we could do in MAXQDA to facilitate a literature review. And here are a list. In fact, I think this is not an exhaustive list. I could probably double the length of this list. But the point is that within the 30 minutes that I've got to talk about this, I can't possibly cover everything. So I'm picking out a few things. And actually, the last couple of years, I have also picked out a few things previously. So in 2021, I looked at importing references and metadata from bibliographic tools, so EndNote, Mendeley, Zotero, etc., and integrating those into MAXQDA. And I also focused then on using documents in MAXQDA to create your own critical appraisals that can then be analysed. And that's one dimension of working indirectly with the literature. And then last year, I focused on using MAXQDA to screen abstracts for inclusion or exclusion in later stages of a literature review, using a sort of systematic literature review or scoping review as an example, and talked about how we can use codes and document sets for that purpose. And then also looked at how we can assess quality in the literature at both quantitative and qualitative levels using codes and variables. So if you're interested in any of those topics, then you can check out the MAXQDA YouTube channel and see some thoughts of mine around those topics. Today, I'm going to be focusing on this direct working with PDF files, okay? And I'm going to be thinking about marking and also paraphrasing as a very efficient and data level interpretive in-depth way of considering our literature in the first instance. And then I'm also going to be thinking about coding, using codes in MAXQDA to systematize our thinking about the literature. First of all, so thinking about different types of reviewing codes, etc., and content-based codes, topic-based codes, and then also thinking about integrating with other data in order to make comparisons. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. Okay, so this is basically just a summary of what I've just said. The only thing on here that I haven't really mentioned is the idea about using codes as different analytical levers in the literature review. That's something that I really want to pull out. So considering when a variable, for example, and a code might be useful to capture the same concept in a literature review, but to do different analytic work with that concept. So I'll come to that when we're in software. Okay, so I mentioned this idea about direct versus indirect working. And what do I actually mean by that? So let's just take it out of the context of MAXQDA for a moment. And if we were working with hard copy materials on the left-hand side here, if we were working directly, we would get out our highlighter pens. I still have highlighter pens. I use them a lot. Just because I'm an advocate of MAXQDA doesn't mean that I don't use highlighter pens. But this is what direct working might look like. Scribbling notes on the margin of a piece of literature, highlighting in different colors to kind of indicate different aspects of interest and commonality in the materials. And we can do very similar things inside MAXQDA, working directly on the PDFs. And I'll show how that works in a moment. The indirect working is on the right-hand side here, when we might have our article, but we're actually writing notes, maybe in a nice notepad or on a piece of paper. And those notes that we're making about our PDF are separate from the PDF. So it's the notes that we make that become the means through which we subsequently analyze the data. And that would be one example of what I call indirect working. And in previous spotlights that I've done on this topic, I've talked about using MAXQDA for that indirect way of working as well. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So what I'm going to do now is just flick into MAXQDA, and I've created mocked up a little project here with a few full text PDF articles. You can see here I've got a document group called literature, and there are, I don't know how many there are. Let me just activate to find out. Oh yes, there are 8 full text articles in here at the moment. And you can see that I've done a little bit of work on them already. I've created a couple of memos. I've done a little bit of coding. I can see that by the numbers down here, indicating the number of coded segments in each article. And you can see some of the codes down here, which I'll look at in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to start off talking about that idea of initially paraphrasing. And one of the reasons I like to talk about this in respect to literature is that there's been a couple of moments over the past many years that I've been working in the field of using software for qualitative analysis, when I've had people come to my workshops and been using software to do literature reviewing and kind of have ended up with literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of codes, sometimes generated by doing a series of word frequency queries. You may be aware that MAXQDA has lots of ways in which we can find, search for content and get coding done very quickly. And I've come across many people who are trying to use the software as a shortcut for actually reading the material in depth themselves. And for most of us, that's a shortcut that's not going to be very fruitful. So what I really like to encourage is the idea that we can take that direct kind of approach on our articles and read them inside the software. So I'm just going to bring in another article here that I haven't done any work on yet. Here's a full text PDF article. And just to highlight to you that in MAXQDA, we do have these wonderful highlighter pen icons at the top here that allow me to, in a very similar way as I might do with my actual highlighter pens, to highlight interesting segments of text as I read through. And that could be something that I'm initially doing just without making any notes. Maybe I'm doing it randomly today, of course, because I haven't got time in this session to think and read at the same time. But hopefully you can see that that process of highlighting using MAXQDA's highlighter pen icons here is actually a coding exercise. So as well as highlighting, it's also gathering them together, allowing me later on to retrieve them. So here are all of the segments that I indicated were interesting by highlighting them in that pink color, and I can access that not only from that overview, but also in the retrieve segments window, just by activating that code and that article. And I've got all the segments that I highlighted in that particular color. So that's one way in which we can replicate that direct working highlighter pen way. But when we are highlighting and reading in that way, we're also having a lot of thoughts in our mind, aren't we, about what we're seeing and thinking when we read the materials. And the paraphrase tool in MAXQDA, which we access from the analysis main menu, if I turn on the paraphrase tool, when I select some text here as I'm reading it with the paraphrase tool on, I'm able to add my deep and meaningful, I'm just going to write deep and meaningful comment in here about whatever it is that I'm reading. And that will allow my little thoughts, very equivalent to what I showed you in that hard copy, to be there as well. Okay, so that is also a very useful way of not only capturing what's interesting, but also writing something interesting at the segment that I'm reading as I'm reading it. And the powerful thing about that for literature reviewing is that it's visualized here on the right-hand side. I'm reading, I'm commenting, I'm marking, and incidentally, I can do both those things together. So I can just quickly flick out of paraphrase mode if I want to add a different color. And then I can flick back into paraphrase mode if I want to add another, oops, that's a different way of selecting. If I want to add another paraphrase, here's another, oops. I seem to have gone into shouting at myself. Another comment here. So the ability to flick backwards and forwards between those different ways of working directly is so easy to enact in MAXQDA now. It's really excellent. So that's the equivalent way of working. But what's powerful about this is the fact that both of those are gathered together. So I already showed you how the highlight codes are retrievable, but hopefully you can see here that those paraphrases have also been gathered together at this kind of code down here. So what I'll show you now is the idea that if I went through and read my articles and highlighted and paraphrased in that way, later on I can double click on here and see all of those paraphrase segments embedded within their source context. That's one of the things that's so difficult to enable when we're working outside of software like MAXQDA that has everything interconnected in the way that it does. But also I can then start to code my paraphrased segments, because we have this wonderful tool which is called categorize paraphrases. And I can go there and that will enable me to see all of the segments that I have paraphrased, 16 paraphrases, and I can then start coding. I'm just going to show you how that works. This one is my deep and meaningful comment, which is not very deep and meaningful. So let's move down a bit further to some examples which were a bit more deep and meaningful. So here is a comment that I made in a segment from this article about defining volunteering. And you can see on the right-hand side, I've got the paraphrase segment available. I can take those off and just work with my comments if I want to, but I often like to see both. And I've got a code here already called definitions of volunteering. So I can then just code that paraphrase segment. This one is about something different. It's not really a definition. It's about exchange in volunteering. So maybe I've got a little group of codes about volunteering here. My whole literature review is about volunteering, by the way. And I can add a new code here and call it exchanging. I can add a code memo to define what I mean by that at the moment of making it if I want to, or I can come back and do that later, and then I can just start coding. So down here, I'm sort of categorizing my codes as or my paraphrase. I'm categorizing my paraphrases as I go through, and then I will end up with the ability of seeing those categorized paraphrases. So I'm reading the data, I'm thinking about the data, I'm making notes about the data, and then I'm going through the stage of actually categorizing my thinking. So not immediately going to that level of coding. So I'll just go through and do a few of these. This one's about voluntary action. Volunteering as action, etc., etc. Okay, and I can, if I want to, code the same paraphrase segment to more than one code if I want to. It doesn't have to be a discrete process. So I can just go through and code in that way. And one of the nice things about that is that those paraphrases, what I wrote initially, are always still there on the right-hand side. I can see them here, but they've also been transferred into comments associated with the coded segment as well. And that's what that little filled in circle there is showing me. And what that means is that when I retrieve a code later on, any of those coded segments that initially began life as paraphrases, like this one here, you can see the original paraphrase. The segment has now been coded to this code, give something back. But what was put in the paraphrase initially is linked with that coded segment as well. So MAXQDA really closes that circle of interconnectivity between those different levels of working. So working really at the data level, capturing those little insights and thoughts that we have when we read our literature, and maintaining our connection with those when we abstract later on to the coding level. So rather than start the process by initially coding, I personally, of course, you can go straight into coding if you want to. I can just select something. I can just select something and immediately code it to a particular code if I think that's got something to do with giving back, without going through that first phase of paraphrasing if I want to. But for me, reading, thinking, capturing those notes before I start coding, I find to be very, very useful when I want to work directly with my literature in a review. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a few other things, which is about using codes for other reviewing type purposes when we're working directly with our literature. So the codes I've just been using very quickly there are all to do with the topic of this literature review, volunteering. But you may have noticed that there's a group, there are several groups of other codes that I've used here. So for example, I sometimes will capture the structure of the literature for example, the abstract, the introduction, the objectives, the research questions, etc., the methods. So the core structures by coding. So for example, all of the findings or results sections in a study will be coded there, etc., so that I can quickly look at how the arguments are being presented or developed as the article progresses. So that's something that's sometimes relevant. I'm also often, it depends of course on the focus of your literature review, what the purpose of the review is, but I may be interested in capturing the methods that have been used in studies to research this topic of volunteering, and I will often differentiate between general methods and then more specific methods maybe. I may also want to be capturing the data that's used in the studies. So if I'm interested, for example, to understand, okay, how has this topic of volunteering been explored, been researched previously, then those kinds of codes may be useful, but also thinking about the aspect of appraisal in literature review, I may have a group of codes which allow me to capture my judgment of the quality or evaluating the literature in some respect. And I've often found it useful to distinguish between sort of general evaluative codes. I think this is a good study, or this is a good example of something, or not so good, or whatever, and differentiating between the general evaluation of what the piece of literature that I'm reading from the evaluation of that piece of literature in relation to the study that I'm doing myself. And that's what's going on differently with these two subcodes for evaluations, but you can create them and use them as you like. But what I'm doing here is I'm capturing in the material. So for example, if this bit here, it's not, but let's imagine it was about the use of qualitative methods in this study. So I code it to the topic that it's about. And if I think that what they're saying there is a high quality way of describing their qualitative methods, it would get tagged to that as well. Equally, if I thought it wasn't very good, then I would be coding it to low. So I'm using codes to tag both the content of what I'm seeing, what they're talking about, whether that's the methods that they're using or the topic of my study, etc., and the evaluation that I'm giving to it. Why do I do that? Because I want to map out maybe whether certain studies have a higher or otherwise quality or evaluation based on my way of thinking about the data. So I'm just going to show you how that might look. Here, for example, I've got codes around a few codes around the data that has been used in these studies. So I'm just going to activate those, and I'm just going to look at those in relation to these evaluative codes for adequate and not adequate. And I can do that using one of MAXQDA's visuals tools, which is a code relations browser. So I'm going to have the activated codes, these ones here, sample, interviews, surveys. as rows, and I'm going to choose the codes that I want to have as the columns, which are going to be 2 of my evaluative codes. And what I'm then able to do later on is to map out how many articles, how many segments in the first instance. This is counting coded segments. And then I can switch that here to the number of articles where I have assessed there to be an adequate or otherwise description of the data that has been used or whatever it might be. So thinking about tagging the material according to those topics and the evaluative criteria that you might be using is something that I found very useful when working directly in this way. Okay, so I mentioned the idea that sometimes I have codes and variables. So let's just take the survey questionnaires code, for example. There's 12 segments here. And at the moment, if I just activate that one and all of my literature and then open up my retrieve segments window here, I've got all of the segments where the different articles have been talking about the use of surveys in order to research this topic of volunteering. Okay, so I'm capturing how they're talking about the use of surveys. And as you can see, there are several pieces of literature where multiple segments have been coded to that code. But the code is capturing how they're talking about it. And that's really useful when I want to use those evaluative codes for thinking about, well, actually, they're just saying that they did a survey, but not really giving me any sense of why that was useful or methodologically any rigor in that, just by saying that they used a survey. That's quite different, that capturing that evaluation through those codes, then capturing the fact that these articles are using surveys to investigate volunteering rather than interviews or whatever else it might be. And that's for me the difference between the document variable and the code. So if I just quickly go to the variables, I've got a list of document variables that I've just started here. I've got relevance, sample size, etc. Let's just flick to the other view so that you can see I've only just started to add them in here. But for example, you know, if I create a new, let's go back and create a new variable just to show you how to do that. So if I create a new variable and call this data type, there's my actual variable. And when I flick back into this view, I'll just sort it. So I'm only looking at my my literature. This one, Harris, that's the one that I was just looking at. Well, they're using surveys. So I will indicate here that they're using surveys. Maybe this one is using interviews. So what I'm doing here is I'm capturing through the variables the fact that this article is using surveys to investigate the topic, and this article is using interviews to investigate the topic, or whatever that might be. And that's very different from capturing through coding how they are talking about their use of interviews or surveys within the article or the report that they're writing. And that's what I mean about the same concept, surveys in this example, or data used, being often very usefully operationalized using two different components of the MAXQDA software, sometimes a code to capture how it's being discussed, and sometimes a variable to capture that it's being discussed. And what that does is that allows me to group the data later on. Later on, I can activate my documents. I can create sets out of those variables in order to create subsets. These are all the studies that investigate this topic using these methods as opposed to those methods, as well as being able to always access at the codes and the intersection, the overlap between the codes, how they're talking about those ways of researching, as well as my evaluation of it. Okay, as per usual, I'm running out of time, but I just do want, before I take questions, just to say something very brief about my last topic that I wanted to cover today, which was that idea of integrating. And I get asked, probably one of the most frequent questions I get asked about literature reviewing in the context of MAXQDA is, oh, I'm doing a literature review and it's part of a bigger study. Should I have one MAXQDA project for my literature review and another MAXQDA project for my data analysis? And almost always my answer is no, because what I want to enable is the ability to, via a code, capture what the literature says about something. Okay, so I can code, as you've already seen today, what the literature is saying about this topic. I may be writing my appraisals in memos or elsewhere, and I can link my codes to those as well. But when I go and gather my data, the same code can be used to code the segments within those data files. Okay. And if I'm writing up my interpretation at the same time, those can also be linked to the codes. And if I have everything in one MAXQDA project, I'm able via the code to access what the literature said about this, what I thought about it when I read the literature, what my data is saying about this, and what I now think. And if your literature review is part of a bigger study where part of the aim is to identify gaps and to design research in order to fill those gaps, having everything together in one MAXQDA project and using codes to bring together the evidence, if you like, from those different sources, the literature itself, you're thinking of the literature, the data itself, you're thinking about the data, is for me incredibly powerful and one of the main reasons why I would choose to use software. So let me just show you that, and then I will stop talking, I promise. So let's take this code here, give something back, okay? If I quickly do a code matrix browser only for that code, but this time by documents, you'll see I've got some focus groups and some interviews in here, okay, which have also been coded. What I can quickly do via a code matrix browser is access the talk about this one, or it could be multiple topics, themes, concepts, theories, whatever the code represents, amongst the literature, and then amongst the different types of data I've got. And I can see the frequency here, which might be interesting, but much more useful for me is the interactive quote matrix, one of my favorite features, which allows me to see, okay, these are all the segments that I coded to this concept, giving something back in the context of volunteering. That's what the literature is saying about that. This is what the focus group data is saying about that. This is what the interview data is saying about that. And that really allows me to pull all of those sources of material, of evidence together through the use of an integrated project in MAXQDA. Okay, you probably get the idea that I could carry on talking about this for a lot longer, but I'm going to stop there to open it up to questions. So let's just have a look in the Q&A. So I'm going to start at the top of the list. Do you summarize? Do you do summaries of the codes used on the literature using paraphrases? How can we use the paraphrases to this aim? Yeah, so the paraphrases are really summaries of an individual segment of data, and they are pulled together via that paraphrase segment code there. The summary of them, I guess, happens by coding them, okay? Dandara. So when I opened up the categorize paraphrase tool, what I was effectively doing was by categorizing those paraphrase segments using these codes. So saying this is a definition of volunteering, this is about exchanging, this is obligation to volunteer, or whatever it might be. I'm effectively abstracting to that conceptual level. I'm not summarizing in the sense of writing my summaries of that, but I'm summarizing conceptually. And then what I would do if I'd worked that way, working very bottom up, yes, that's a very inductive way of working, then I would probably create a memo. So here is a memo about giving something back. So as I'm going through that process, I can access that memo and I can add a definition up here. I can even start adding a summary here. So I think that would be one way of doing that when you're going from the paraphrase to the code to the summary. But some of you may have been at my earlier session about summaries. We could also subsequently put those codes into the summary feature, so using summary grids, summary tables, etc., if you wanted to do it that way. So that's part of the flexibility about MAXQDA, is that you have multiple places where you can do those kinds of tasks. I hope that answers your question. How do you connect your codes of your research to the literature codes? I'm hoping that I kind of answered that question along the way, Varda. So at the outset, so I like to keep the top level codes nice and cohesive, so separate from one another. So at the moment, in this very early version that I created just for this spotlight, you know, most of the codes are what I would call literature reviewing codes, whereas only the ones under volunteering are topic-based codes. But that process of tagging, I like to think about, in another session, I think it was the grounded theory session, I think it was Steve who said about thinking about coding as indexing. So that's a really useful way of thinking about coding. You know, I'm just looking at each bit of data and deciding what's going on in here that's interesting to me. And it could be a topic, but it could also be, well, they're talking about definitions of volunteering whilst they're also talking about interviewing in order to understand that. So it kind of gets tagged or indexed to all of those things that are relevant. And that all then comes together. I've just realized I didn't show you a group of my favorite codes here. I'll just leave you these ones here for you to have a look at, what I call reviewing codes, which are really useful for literature reviews. Best ways to learn more, Adam, to learn more about using MAXQDA for literature reviews. Stefan's just added a link to a really great document to have a look at. There are a few other spotlights happening that might be relevant, and myself and other trainers do workshops where we focus on these sorts of things in a much more focused way with much more time. Where are we? Earlier, after linking the paraphrase with codes, the text in the paraphrase became comments. Yes, that's what happens automatically. What if we want to edit the comment? We can edit the comment. Will it change the paraphrase? It won't change the paraphrase, I don't believe. So here's a paraphrase. You've asked me a question that I can't remember the answer to, so let's work it out. So that's the paraphrase. Volunteer is defined as voluntary action. If I access that and add something here, I'll just write something at the end. That changes the comment, but not the paraphrase. So once you've categorized the paraphrase, then the comment you initially wrote in the paraphrase goes into the comment, and that can be changed, but the original will always remain there. I like that, actually, because that means that I can track and see the stages of my thinking. So this was my initial thinking, and then whatever I put in the comment subsequently is a means of adding my thinking. In fact, we had a similar question earlier. I could add the date. What is the date? I don't know. 22nd Feb before I write my next bit. So I'm sort of, you know, maybe I made this comment on the 20th of January or something. I can indicate the stages of my thinking evolving, but my original thinking will stay static at the paraphrase, which is quite useful. I already did a lot of reading and used notes on the PDF files. Yes, so one thing that has been implemented into MAXQDA now is that if you've got highlights or comments in PDFs, when you import them, they will be transferred over into MAXQDA as comments and codes. So have a go at that, Varda, and you should be happy with the results. The comments if you've used a comment field in Adobe or something like that, they'll come in as memos rather than paraphrases, but they'll definitely be there. In your literature folder at the top left, how do you organize the articles? Oh, good question. So I haven't organized the articles at this level. So how I would organize using document groups depends on whether I'm doing a literature review only or whether I'm doing a literature review that's part of a bigger project. If it's part of a bigger project, I would normally have all of my literature in one folder called literature, and all of the other materials that I'm working with in they're not called folders, but they're called groups for different data types. And that's just a research design thing. You know, if I've got different types of data, there'll always be moments when I just want to focus on all the literature, or I just want to focus on all the focus groups or whatever. So for that reason, I do it like that. And then I would use variables and subsequently sets to add more organizational power. So I did show you a few variables. There aren't very many in this project, but this is where I'm capturing topics. If I wanted to organize by topic, I'd have a variable called topic, etc. And then later on, I'll do it using this method general one. I can basically activate my documents based on variables. So I can say, okay, well, I'm interested in all of the articles that I've previously using a variable. Let me try to choose one that's got a few more with a mixed design and create a new set. And then I end up with a set down here, and that doesn't move them. It just creates a subset, and that allows me to add that organizational layer. But because I'm probably going to want to look at all of the literature together and compare with all of the focus groups and all of the interviews in the way that I showed you earlier, I wouldn't over-organize at the level of the group. I try to keep my groups nice and simple and use variables and then sets to complexify that organization, if that makes sense. There's a few more. Please, could you recommend articles or books regarding literature review? I think Stefan's already added in one of the pieces of literature around using MAXQDA for literature reviews, which is definitely worth looking at. I would recommend that you have a look at that article that I mentioned as a starting point if you're new to doing literature reviews, which is in the slides. You should have been given access to the PDF of the slides. That's a good starting point for the overall overarching view of different types of literature review. But do feel free to reach out and email me if you have more specific question about types of articles you're interested in. Paul's asked a question about the pros and cons of using RAS in comparison to PDF files. So the RAS import, Paul, can bring in the full text PDF articles as well, or you can work in a more incremental way in the way that I've just done. So in this example that I've talked through today, this is much more of a sort of in-depth literature review when I may be reading an article, reviewing it, thinking about it, and then going and finding another piece of literature, maybe as a result of what I've read in this previous one. And in that way, you know, if that's the nature of how you're going about reviewing the literature, I would normally just bring in one at a time as I go through and read them. If I'm doing more of a systematic review, then I may already have done a lot of work of identifying which article is going to be part of the review and have those all in EndNote or RefWorks or whatever. And that would be when I would do quite a lot of work in that bibliographic reference management tool to get the metadata all right and all of that stuff, and then bring that in. And one of those previous, I think not last year, but the year before Spotlight, I talked about that process. So for me, it's to do with the nature of the review and how I'm going about it. I think there's another question. I'm getting slightly confused about which are the new questions. Will you later delete the blue-green highlighting to keep your coding system clean? Carolina asks. Yeah, maybe. Or if I decide that all of the things that I've highlighted in magenta or blue are actually related to a particular concept, I will just rename that code. So I can rename that and call it, what might I call it? Volunteering practice or something. I can't spell anymore. And then I can just move it into another area of my coding scheme. And that little highlight mark will remain there. And that just reminds me that that's how it started off life. If I realize, well, there's nothing really very meaningful going on at that green label, then of course I can just delete it. So I think the answer would be it depends on whether I decide that what I've highlighted is useful later on in my analysis or not. Okay, I think I've gone over time a little bit and it's coming to the end of the session, and I know that there are some opportunities for networking happening now, so I'll leave it there. I will just put my email address in the chat, and if anybody wants to get in touch, then I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation via email. Thanks, everyone. I hope you found it useful.